Great. So hello, everyone. Welcome to another Novec Talk. My name is Paulius. I am the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics at the University of Pennsylvania. And thank you for joining us for another talk. We will follow today a very similar agenda to previous occasions. There's a short welcome that I always give, 5 minutes. Then we will have 10 minutes in total for our 5-minute pre-recorded video from an early career researcher. In this occasion, Woo-Jin Kim from the University of California, Berkeley, will be joining us. Then we will have our main speaker for today, Professor Sunstein from Harvard University, and then at the end, 15 minutes of Q&A. So as I always do, I'd like to remind you that NOBEC, or Norms and Behavioral Change Talks, is organized by our Penn Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics at the University of Pennsylvania, with the support of the PPE program and the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences here at Penn. We are a research center that works with organizations all over the world to enact positive behavioral and norm change. We were founded by Professor Christina Vicari, and we do mainly consulting, research, and training. In terms of our NOBEC talks, this is our 33rd NOBEC talk. We've been doing this since 2021. The spring-summer programming is underway now. So as you know, today we'll have Professor Sunstein, and then the next 2 days, each separated by 2 weeks, will be Peter Hall from Brown University and Erin Krupka from the University of Michigan. If you're joining today, you are already in our list, so you will get reminder emails and the videos of the talk and everything to your email, and you can also access our webpage or scan this QR code to get more details and watch all the 32 videos of talks that we have. And then a short reminder, as I have done in the few previous talks, that our in-person NOBEC conference, Norms and Behavioral Change Conference, is on the 13th and 14th October here at Penn. The keynotes will be Professor Michelle Gelfand from Stanford University and Professor Leonardo Bernstein from the University of Chicago. We also have a pre-conference event on norms in the developing world. And our call for papers and posters is now open, and we still have 2 weeks left for you to submit paper and poster abstracts. More information, of course, in the webpage novecconference.com. And then if this is the first time that you're joining, a few ground rules. Please keep yourself muted during the talk. If you can, please keep your camera on so that we have a more interactive experience. For questions, you can use the chat at any time or the raise hand function at the end. We won't have a co-author in the audience today, but so please write your questions in the chat and use the raise hand function. And then, as I already mentioned, all the recordings of our sessions are uploaded and will be uploaded in our website, novectalks.com. With that, I am happy to introduce our NOBEC early career researcher for today. Woo-Jin Kim is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley. The talk is called Peer Persuasion in Social Norm Enforcement. And I believe Woo-Jin should be here in the audience. So if you are here, would you please introduce yourself in a couple of minutes?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Woo-Jin Kim. I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley. I'm broadly interested in psychology and economics, a little bit of political econ as well. And I love thinking about social norms. So please, if you have any thoughts about my experiment, you can email me at woojin@berkeley.edu, and look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. Please feel free to leave your email, website, links, anything you want in the chat. So as in previous occasions, I will share the 5-minute video, and then you will be able to ask questions and connect with Woojin over the chat.
Hello everyone, I'm Woojin Kim from UC Berkeley, and this is a sprint through my experiment on peer persuasion in social norm enforcement. Suppose it's almost the deadline to register to vote for the presidential election, and you find out that one of your colleagues hasn't registered yet. Do you tell them that they should? In past experiments and in our daily lives, many of us seem hesitant to confront someone who's not complying with a social norm. But why? For starters, we might think that even if we say something, it won't persuade the other person. Or maybe because we're altruistic, we don't want to shame them or to call them out. And of course, there are many self-interested reasons as well. It takes effort and we don't want to get into a fight. This paper is looking at peer-to-peer, organic, decentralized social pressure, focusing on the mechanism of verbal confrontation. In this study, over 1,000 university students across 4 University of California campuses were asked to send a pressuring email to another student on their campus. The experiment extracts the willingness to pay to send or not to send this email, along with 2 key beliefs, all incentivized just before the California voter registration deadline for the 2020 general election. After we first determined who had registered or not in the initial survey, we matched 3 non-registrants, who are the recipients in the study, to each registrant, who are the senders. Then the senders logged on and saw their 3 potential recipients who hadn't registered yet. We told them that they could be randomly selected to send a pressuring email message to one of the recipients, and showed them a template for the email. And note the strong normative language here. Don't you plan on voting? There's no excuse not to. Importantly, we randomly varied within the sender whether each of the 3 recipients would have to be emailed directly, so the sender would have to send the email from their own campus account, or anonymously, in which case we would send the message for them. Now for the first of the 2 key beliefs. We ask the sender what they think is the % chance that each recipient will register to vote without a message, and then with the message. The difference between the 2 is the predicted persuasive effect of the message in percentage points. For the second belief, we ask the sender how much they think each recipient will like or dislike the message on a Likert scale. And for the outcome, we elicit the sender's willingness to pay to message each recipient through a binary search choice procedure. So, do these beliefs actually matter? Here's a bin scatter with the sender's willingness to pay on the y-axis and the predicted persuasive effect on the x-axis. Senders predict their email would increase the recipient's chances of registering by over 10 percentage points on average, which is a huge effect. And the positive slope tells us that senders who think their message will be more effective are also more willing to send it. And even though senders expect the direct message to be more effective, there's a level shift down that indicates some fixed cost for sending the message directly rather than anonymously. For the second belief, these are the frequency of responses in each Likert bin. Senders actually think that recipients will dislike the direct message more than the anonymous one. And this is the average willingness to pay to send them direct message within each Likert bin. You see that senders who think the recipient will strongly dislike the message are willing to pay $2 to avoid sending it. And this willingness to pay increases almost linearly, so that on the other end, senders who believe the recipient will like it would pay $2 to send it themselves. But when messaging anonymously, senders are much less sensitive to the recipient's dislike of the message. When we put all this in a regression, the same patterns bear out. The predicted effectiveness predicts willingness to pay, and there's a large fixed cost for sending directly. And looking at the coefficients on the recipient's dislike, we see that 2/3 of the sender's sensitivity to this belief only appear with direct communications. And just to glance on 2 more results in the paper, some senders were instead assigned to a info message placebo condition, and reassuringly we see that senders don't care about persuading others to take some random action like they do for a norm. And under some assumptions, using the direct versus anonymous comparison, we find that 2/3 of the sender's motives come from self-regarding sources, such as avoiding conflict or an awkward interaction, the remainder from other regarding motives, such as norm compliance or altruism. To conclude, we've learned that those who are willing to confront tend to believe that they are more persuasive and the recipient will dislike the message less. We also see that direct confrontation is costly for senders, but it makes them more sensitive to the recipient's dislike of the message, even if it's for self-interested reasons. And as with everything in economics, there's a trade-off. Facilitating anonymous channels of communication might increase peer enforcement, but then the confronters may overlook the welfare cost to the recipient when deciding whether to pressure others. If you have any thoughts, please feel free to email me at woojin@berkeley.edu, and thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Woojin, again for participating and for the great talk. So yeah, as I mentioned, unfortunately, we don't have time for live questions in this section, but feel free to write any questions or send any comments or connect with Woojin over the chat. And with that, so yeah, with that, we are very happy today to welcome Professor Cass Sunstein from Harvard University. Professor Sunstein is currently the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard. He is the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. In 2018, he received the Holberg Prize from the government of Norway. And in 2020, the World Health Organization appointed him as chair of its Technical Advisory Group on Behavioral Insights and Sciences for Health. He was also an administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs and served on the President's Review Board on Intelligence and Communication Technologies and on the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Board. He has advised officials at the United Nations, the European Commission, the World Bank, and many nations on issues of law and public policy, and he is an advisor of the Behavioral Insights team in the United Kingdom. The talk for today, as you know, is called Beatlemania, and we have as moderator Professor Enrique Fatas, who's a practice professor here at Penn at the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences, and a senior research fellow from our center at Penn. So thank you so much, Professor Sunstein, for joining us, and please feel free to share your screen and go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and actually a joy to get to talk to you. I have no slides, so I hope you like this spare background, and my jacket is okay. This is just going to be oral, and the title is Beatlemania. And this is a labor of love, and I'm hoping to convince you that this is going to bear our seemingly what's the right word? I want to hold your hand topic, that this is actually relevant to fundamental questions about culture. My epigraph is from a professor named Jackson, H.L. Jackson, and here's how it goes. If we were to put ourselves in the place of their contemporaries and judge by the implicit standards of the public circa 1820, Keats would trail far behind Cornwall, and Hunt would lead the group. If we accepted the standards of professional critics of the time, Cornwell would outrank Hunt, and Keats would be in third place. Yesterday, the brilliant film from 2019 asks a provocative question: what would happen in a world in which the Beatles had never existed, but in which one person, by a kind of magic, knows all their songs and delivers them fresh to that world? The power of the film lies in its ability to engage the audience, to hear songs from the Beatles as if they were new. What if we just heard, like right before this talk, I saw her standing there Let It Be, Yesterday, or Here Comes the Sun. Yesterday, the movie, allows viewers to ask that question and, in a sense, to experience the answer, to discover the Beatles all over again. More important for my purposes here, the film contains an empirical hypothesis, which it makes plausible or perhaps irresistible. The Beatles were surpassingly great, and their greatness was a guarantor of spectacular popularity whenever and however their music emerged. But the film is a cheat. The audience already knows the songs. We cannot unhear them. As we watch the movie, we start in a state of incredulity. We can't believe that people are acting as if they have not heard and have never heard of the Beatles. Sure, we can experience the thrill of hearing their music as if it were fresh. The movie directs us to do that. But the songs aren't new to us. We already love them. We don't need to be introduced to them. So the film does not vindicate its central claim to the effect that because of their amazing music, the success of the Beatles and the rise of Beatlemania were inevitable. Over 10 years ago, Matthew Salganik, Duncan Watts, and Peter Dawes investigated the sources of cultural success and failure. Their large-scale randomized controlled trial was motivated by by awareness that popularity is sometimes very challenging to predict. They wanted to ask, why are predictions so difficult? To find out, they created an artificial music market on a real website. The site offered people an opportunity to hear dozens of songs, real songs, by unknown bands. About 14,000 site visitors were in an independent judgment group in which they were invited to listen to brief excerpts and to decide whether to download songs. So from those visitors, the researchers could obtain a clear sense of what people liked best. The other visitors, thousands of them, were sorted randomly into social influence groups, which were just the same, except in one respect. They could see how many times each song had been downloaded by other participants. So think of it as one world, which is the control, and then treatment groups in which people could see the number of downloads in their own subgroup in real time. We might expect that different songs would inevitably attract different initial numbers of downloads as a result of serendipitous or random factors. There's a song called Trapped in an Orange Peel, I didn't make that up, that might attract strong support from the first listeners, but not so much in another. There's a song called Separation Anxiety. I didn't make that up either. That might be unpopular in its first hours in one subgroup, but not another. The question is whether the initial numbers would affect where songs would end up ultimately, where ultimately just say, after a lot of time, in terms of number of downloads. We might predict, consistent with the hypothesis of yesterday, that in the end, quality will prevail and that the popularity of the songs, as measured by their download rankings, will be roughly the same in the control and in all of the treatment groups. That's not what happened. Trapped in an Orange Peel could be a big hit or a miserable flop, depending on whether a lot of other people initially downloaded it and were seen to have done so. Everything turned on initial popularity. Almost any song could be popular or horrifically unpopular, depending on whether or not the first visitors liked it. There's one qualification relevant to Beatlemania, that is that the songs that did the very best in the control never completely flopped, and the songs that did very worst in the control never did spectacularly well. But otherwise, almost anything would happen. A cautious reading of the findings would be that some cultural products are destined for success and others are doomed to failure. Under the cautious reading, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, Taylor Swift, John Keats, and Charles Dickens were just going to do well. I think that's too cautious. In the real world, the number of countervailing factors is so numerous. Media attention, critical acclaim, product placement, marketing, and sheer luck, that the less cautious reading would be serendipity dominates, and destined for success is a highly speculative and unlikely hypothesis. I'll get to that in the context of the Beatles. What the Music Lab uncovered was a set of informational cascades, which illuminates Beatlemania in its many forms. Trumpmania, Obamamania, favorite serial of 2022, mania. Mania with respect to critical race studies, mania with respect to negative reactions to critical race studies. To see how informational cascades work, imagine that 7 people are in a reading group deciding which book to try next. John, the first in the group, says the one to try is a new book about the Beatles. Paul, the second to speak, now knows John's judgment. He should certainly go along with John if he's also enthusiastic about the book. If he's indifferent and trusts John a little bit even, he might simply go along with John. Now turn to a third person. You won't be surprised to hear his name, George. Suppose that after John and Paul have said that they want to try the book about the Beatles, George's own view, based on his own limited information, is the book isn't so great probably. Even if George has that view, he might well ignore what he knows and just follow John and Paul. If so, George is in a cascade. True, George will resist if he has sufficient grounds to think that John and Paul are being foolish, but if he lacks those grounds, he might well go along with them. Now suppose that Ringo, Brian, Yoko, and Linda are expected to express their views. If John, Paul, and George have all said that the new book on the Beatles is the one to read, each of them might well reach the same conclusion in sequence. And in this highly artificial and stylized example, people are amplifying the volume of the informational signal to which they are themselves contributing. The informational cascade might not be terribly robust if the book is horrible, but we can imagine circumstances in which its non-horribleness is sufficient to create widespread popularity for the book, even though in something like a control condition, that book would have flopped. That's mostly what's going on in the Salganik et al. Experiment. With cultural products, though, including the Beatles, presidential candidates, political ideas, ideas in social psychology, ideas in law and in history, people pay attention to the views of others, not only because of the informational signal, but also because of reputational pressure. People might incur a reputational tax if they say critical race theory is great, or they might enjoy a reputational subsidy if they say, I think the 2020 election was stolen. People follow the views and actions of others in part because they want to avoid wrath or to produce approval. And both the sign and the magnitude of the reputational incentive might be surprising. In a reputational cascade, people go along with others with respect to, let's say, the wonderfulness or not of ethnic groups, the value or not of discrimination, not because they're in favor of or opposed to those things, but they want to maintain the good opinion of others. We can easily generate a reputational sibling to the informational cascade I described with respect to choice of books, with respect to favorite singer, with respect to favorite cultural product of any kind, with respect to laptops and social media sites and ideas. Okay, I haven't said anything about network effects, but of course they are very important for cultural products. Some things can be enjoyed by oneself, a walk in the sun, a cup of coffee, a quick swim. Other pleasures are guilty. You might love a silly television show and not want anyone to know that you do and not really care whether anyone else likes it. Cultural products often benefit greatly from network effects. They're taken to be something of which one should be aware. It might not be a lot of fun to stare blankly when someone makes a knowing reference to Yesterday, Hey Jude, Let It Be, or even For No One. Apologies if you don't know that song. It's pretty good. If people think that other people like the Beatles and focus on them, they might join them for one reason above all. They don't want to be left out. They want to be part of the relevant group. John Lennon faced a horrific backlash when he remarked that the Beatles had become more popular than Jesus, but he was capturing the existence of network effects from which the Beatles greatly benefited. Christianity too, by the way. Taylor Swift is terrific, but she is a massive success in part because people want to be part of the ever-growing group of people who know about and appear to like Taylor Swift. We've now explored informational cascades, reputational cascades, and network effects. We just have one other mechanism, which is group polarization, by which deliberating groups typically end up more unified, more extreme, and more confident as a result of group interactions. The result is that groups often make more extreme decisions than with the average or typical individual in the group, where extreme is defined only internally by reference to the group's initial dispositions. I've done myself studies of group polarization in the context of punitive damage judgments by juries, and also in the context of political opinion on climate change and civil rights issues, finding that groups that are left of center tend to become very left of center as a result of discussions with one another. And the same is true that groups are right of center. In non-experimental settings, randomized assignment of federal judges to 3-judge courts of appeals shows, not experimental at all, that a Republican appointee will tend to show very, very conservative voting patterns if that Republican appointee has 2 other Republican appointees on the panel. And a Democratic appointee will look really left of center over thousands of cases when that Democratic appointee is sitting with 2 Democratic appointees. So think of it this way: Obama, 3-judge panel, they're going to be very left of center on average. Trump, very left of center, very right of center. And what's interesting about that is that all you need is 2 votes. So it's Obama, Trump, they've got the votes. Trump, Obama, they've got the votes, but there's a great moderating effect by having one from the other, another judge appointed by someone from a different political party. Okay, the basic phenomenon of group polarization has been identified in group processes involving questions like whether the United States is kind of bad and untrustworthy. Citizens of France become much more convinced of that after speaking with one another. Forgive me if any of you is French, and I hope a fan of the United States. A group of moderately pro-feminist women, they become really feminist after talking with one another. Whites predisposed to show racial prejudice show more of that if they are in a group with one another, and whites predisposed not to show racial prejudice show less of that after engaged in deliberation with one another. These are not studies of cultural success or failure, but the main explanations for group polarization tend to suggest that Beatlemania in its specific form and in the more global form I'm trying to use the term, is in significant part a product of group polarization. The first mechanism is informational. If people think Beatles are fantastic, oh my gosh, then that's going to spread. and intensified the commitment to the underlying judgment. The other, consistent with reputational cascades, is reputational influence. And the third, the most interesting, which we haven't explored yet, involves the reputation between corroboration, confidence, and extremism. If you tend to think climate change is bad, how bad? I don't know. But then people in your group say it's bad, you're right. Then you're more confident in it and you're likely to become more extreme in your commitment to that view. If you think the Beatles are like a lot better than the Rolling Stones, then if you're surrounded by people who tend to think that, your commitment to it will create more confidence in you as a result of the corroboration, and then more extremism. That seems to be an important mechanism. Okay. Do dynamics of this kind help to explain the success of poets, poems, novelists, novels, songs, and musicians? That's a hard question to answer. The reason is we need to specify the exact hypothesis and then test it. The Music Lab experiment did test a clear hypothesis: would the popularity of songs be affected by social influences so that download rankings would vary across subgroups? Answer, yes, exclamation point. To undertake a comparable test, we might identify a set of novelists, Dickens, Jane Austen, James Joyce, George Orwell, Stephen King, Joyce Carol Oates, treat them like songs and see whether groups in conditions like those in the Music Lab experiment produce similar rankings. The problem over a course of years, that would be a very time-intensive task, because you have to read a novel. That takes a long time. History is not a randomized controlled experiment. It's run only once. For that reason, it's tough to know how to test the thesis with which I'm toying here with respect to poems, novels, music, and the like, which is that history is the Music Lab experiment, just written over long periods of time. And it's not that easy even to specify the specific hypothesis that we're testing. To get at it with this work in progress, I want to return to our epigraph writer, H.J. Jackson, and talk about her study of literary reputation, which can be seen as a book-like version of the Music Lab experiment applied to the canonization of William Wordsworth, John Keats, Jane Austen, and William Blake, all of whom I'm suggesting were a product of Beatlemania and the failure of George Crabbe, Robert Southey, Barry Cornwall, Leigh Hunt, and Mary Brunton. And my guess is that if the median person in this group has heard of two of them, that would be very surprising. They've been lost, though they were regarded as equal or better in their time. Okay, Jackson finds that Keats, Cornwall, and Hunt were thought to be a trio, with Keats the least good in their lifetime, Wordsworth, Crabbe, and Southey, the same could be said, and Austen and Brunton. If you ask their contemporaries which of these people would be famous in the 21st century, they would be startled to see that Keats, Wordsworth, and Austen prevailed. At the time of his death, Keats himself believed he'd failed in his somewhat desperate quest for fame. He left instructions that his own gravestone have no name, but though only these pathetic words, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." This is potentially now the most beloved poet in the English language. In Keats's own time, Cornwall was far more successful. The finding is that Keats's reputation was dependent less on the efforts of particular individuals than on, now I'm quoting Jackson, groups, overlapping networks of like-minded acquaintances, starting up on a small scale, the collective chatter that later became the buzz of fame. Informational cascades, reputational cascades, network effects, and group polarization are all relevant here. Jackson's conclusion, which she makes plausible, is this: as far as reputation is concerned, The differences are largely personal and accidental. At the very least, she urges, it is necessary to come with the conundrum of Barry Cornwall's success with the same audience that spurned Keats. Jackson's conclusion is, notwithstanding the common assumption that over time the best writers come on top, the reception histories suggest that long-term survival has depended more on external circumstances and accidental advantages than on inherent literary worth. Perhaps the most famous literary figures are in fact greater than those who are unknown. We certainly would be strongly inclined to think so, but maybe not. With a little push or shove or heavy download equivalents at the right time, the literary canon would feature Crabbe, Hunt, and Brunton. Okay, we lack counterfactual worlds with respect to the Beatles, and now with your indulgence, I'm going to get concrete with respect to the Beatles. We don't have a randomized controlled trial. Maybe we can get kind of close to that, and efforts to replicate the Music Lab experiment with respect to cultural products and actually political ideas have succeeded. So we've seen the generality of the phenomena. For the Beatles, the best, maybe the only way to evaluate the hypothesis is through fine-grained investigation of history, the only one through which humanity has lived, in search of clues. And that's what I've done. So I'm going to give you my kind of current account of the serendipitous events that made the Beatles' success possible, with the suggestion that the fine-grained inquiry gestures toward counterfactual worlds in which Beatlemania would never have come into existence. We can see the work I'm going to summarize here as a temporally compressed cousin to the study of literary reputation that you just heard about. In their early-ish days, the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Beatles struggled mightily to attract attention. They didn't have a manager. They came close to splitting up in 1961, fearing that they were unlikely to succeed. Not despairing, but close to it, they asked two young secretaries helping to run their small Liverpool fan club to manage them. The secretaries couldn't get them bookings. The initial break came when Brian Epstein, the 27-year-old manager of a record store, happened to come hear them at a lunchtime session at a club. Epstein loved them, and improbably he offered to manage them. He did that even though he lacked experience, and even though the Beatles were unpopular with promoters and were damaged goods, famous for being unreliable, unpunctual, and arrogant. At first, their new manager's efforts proved futile. EMI, a very prominent recording company, refused to record their songs, said no. Epstein got a chance for them to test at Decca, EMI's rival, but the Beatles were terrible, everyone agreed, and Decca turned them down. The company's leadership said, are you listening? The boys won't go. We know these things. You have a good business in Liverpool, Brian Epstein, where you're selling records. Stick to that. At that point, the Beatles were stunned. John Lennon said, that was the end. In Paul McCartney's words, it was all bloody hell. What are we going to do? Epstein, who was relentless, ended up seeing every potential record company, all of them. Everyone refused to sign the Beatles. In desperation, Epstein went back to EMI, the first one that said no, and he played a Beatles tape for George Martin, who's now famously kind of the fifth Beatle, George Martin thought, this is terrible. Not very good songs, a pretty lousy tape, a raw group. Basically, he said no. That would have finished everything, except for two people lost to history. One is named Kim Bennett, and another is named, or was named, I don't know if they're living, Sid Coleman. Epstein had played some Beatles music for them, who liked them. And Coleman, in a very unusual move, said, okay, George Martin, I'll pay you the cost of recording a Beatles record. I'll pay for it. I like them. The session, overseen by Martin, went really badly. And he said, I'm not going to issue any of these songs. He said later, I didn't think the Beatles had any song of any worth. They gave me no evidence whatsoever that they could write hit material. Reluctantly, he agreed to release Love Me Do as a single. He had no confidence of it. And when he mentioned the group's bizarre name to his colleagues in the company, they broke out into laughter. EMI refused to support the song. They wouldn't market it. In Martin's own words, nobody believed in it at all. Love Me Do might have dropped like a stone along with the Beatles' career, except for Epstein's relentlessness and use of his own money for promotion. The group's fan base in Liverpool bought the record and started an informational cascade. The record got mixed reviews, but Epstein wouldn't give up. And at that point, George Martin, the original skeptic, made an astounding decision. He decided to ask the Beatles to record a real album, which turned out to consist mostly of Lennon-McCartney songs, and Martin turned out to be really good at producing the Beatles. Seems implausible, yes, to suggest that the Beatles needed early downloads to succeed, or that Ray Davies of the Kinks, or Graham Nash of the Hollies, or someone of whom we have never heard could have been John Lennon or Paul McCartney. Of course, cascade effects played a large role, and so did network effects and group polarization big time. But these claims are consistent with what I'm describing as a weak account of the role of social influences. In my view, and with fear and trembling, the most plausible conclusion is that the Beatles should be seen as analytically equivalent to the best songs in the Music Lab experiment, in the sense that in the end, they had multiple paths that would have worked out. But that might be an article of faith. It can't be proved, and it might, in the end, be more faith than social science. With respect to band manias that never were, consider the fact that in the domain of innovation in general, empirical work points to lost Einsteins, to those who would have had highly impactful inventions had they been exposed to innovation in childhood. In this work, this empirical work by Raj Chadi and co-authors, the emphasis is on demographic characteristics such as race, gender, and socioeconomic status, and on the contributions of network effects and role models to success. I'm urging that the domain of serendipity is much larger, with many things that have undoubtedly been lost to history. I've pointed to several key moments. There are probably at least 18 others, which we will never be able to identify. We can't rule out the possibility that there are lost Lennons, lost McCartneys, and lost bands that might have turned out to be comparable to the Beatles. If they have been lost, and I think they have, it is not only because of demographic characteristics, but also because of social influences, which didn't work out in their favor. Thank you. So floor is open for questions. I realize
Yes.
I've combined data and stuff that's really rigorous and controlled with history and rank speculation.
So, Cass, I have a question for you, if I may. It seems to me that the final conclusion is, I mean, a little bit on the pessimistic side. Just because of certain social influences, we have lost many Lennons and many McCartneys. So, what would be, if I may use this word, the policy lessons? Can we do something to prevent losing geniuses here and there, not only in music, but also maybe in other domains? Any thoughts?
It's great, thank you. So Timur Kuran has done work on the basically essential unpredictability of revolutions. And it's closely connected with what I'm saying about the Beatles. Yes. And his claim is that there are three things that you would need to know to predict a revolution. You need to know what's actually in people's heads. You need to know what social interactions are going to occur, when and with what number of people and influence people. And you need to know people's thresholds for rebelling. And all of these are basically not one of them is predictable. If we could get some traction on what's in people's heads, and maybe Mark Zuckerberg can do that, or maybe Google can do that, we can have some clues about probabilities. But to know what people's thresholds are, that's really hard. Even if you can look at WhatsApp, which you can't know what people's. So there's. In terms of predicting success, it may be in the nature of the beast that you can assign probabilities, but even those have, have a range of stuff associated with them. I think the policy consequence is a little, the policy implication is cheering, which is that because the possibility of talent is everywhere, and the chance that there's someone who's going to be, an amazing contributor is higher in a region than one would think, and that the person who ends up a failure might have been an entrepreneur or a genius and inventor. It's I think, a pedestrian proposal, but it has maybe more poignancy than it otherwise would. Give everybody a chance. I mean, could it be the case? Could it be the case that the two greatest pop music geniuses in the last 60 years, give or take a Bob Dylan, happened to live kind of really near each other in Liverpool and met each other? That would be too surprising.
Good point. Yeah. Any other question? Oh, yeah. So maybe, Cass, you have a long comment, more than a question, from Kevin Valier in the chat. I don't know if you can see it.
I can. Okay, so I can go over the two. There's one from Nathan Glogauer. Thank you for that. How reliable is prediction as a tool? Well, I recently did a book with Danny Kahneman and Olivier Sibony, which is very focused on this. And some things are predictable, and sometimes you can assign probabilities. Our chapter 11 is really my favorite chapter in the book, and Danny wrote it. So I liking the chapter I didn't do better than any of the ones I did. It is basically very pessimistic about prediction over long time horizons. And it gives an account of why that's in the nature of the beast. But if you want to predict whether if I play tennis against Rafa Nadal, I'm going to win, it's safe. I'm a pretty good club tennis player. And if I get 1 point, that would be very surprising. And I'm not going to get a game. So there's a bunch of domains where predictions are reliable, and we have to think about whether it's just they're easy to do, or whether super forecasters studied by Tetlock have some clues about how to predict well. So there's a lot to be said about that great question. So between network trust and the phenomenon you describe, the trust as a conductor for opinion cascades, absolutely. So question is whether is this going to happen more under high trust conditions? Well, we know that group polarization, if you have 3 people in a 6-person group who agree with Israel on everything, and 3 people in a group who agree with Palestinian Authority on everything, the 3 who agree with Israel might not yield to the people who agree on the Palestinian Authority, and vice versa. So if people have entrenched view and high distrust of their artificial group members, then we won't get polarization. People will be entrenched where they were. And we know that group polarization is heightened if people have a sense of shared identity, and reduced if people don't. So if we're all people who study norms, we might polarize over some norm-related question. If we're all people who live in, Dallas, Texas, same thing. And that I'm not aware. It's much easier to study. Well, I was going to say it's easier to study group polarization than informational cascades. There's actually an empirical experimental literature on informational cascades that I don't believe tests the hypothesis. That'd be really interesting to do. So we have a research project that's emerging here. So to get the boundary conditions for taking account of the informational signal, that's a very great question. So we know much less about informational cascades than we should 30 years ago. Oh, this is a great question. Does it not advocate for high taxation of successful bands and because they got lucky? I think bracketing the question whether high taxation has negative or positive effects on X and Y and Z, the role of serendipity in producing success does, I think, weaken the moral objection to high taxation. So that if people who do spectacularly well, they're amazing. Taylor Swift is amazing, but she could have failed. I say that with a degree of trembling because I'm a great fan of Taylor Swift, and it saddens me, and almost I can't believe that she could have failed. But my head says she could have failed, even though she's great. But she was very lucky too. And are there 10 people in the world who are as talented as Taylor Swift, but they gave up? Yes, there must be. Out of 300 million Americans, would there be 10? Must be. Okay, so on the moral question, I think that's quite right. And the thought that if you are, doing really well in life, each of us probably can think of, yes, 17 things that are a little like what I described for the Beatles that ended up getting us to where we are now, even though we're not as successful as the Beatles.
I have a question related to social media and kind of the role that it plays in helping spread information. Based on this is very based in history and the Beatles. I'm wondering, do you think that social media would have helped propel the information cascade, or would it have been more challenging because their competitors would have had equal access to social media, and so it could have both drowned them out or propelled them? And I guess how has social media at all shaped your thoughts around reputation cascades and whatnot?
It's a great question. So I know a behavioral economist who has written a book not long ago, who's on Twitter, who a period after he wrote his book, he would tweet, "My book is doing much better than expectations. Thank you for the support." And then I'd look at his book on Amazon and it's doing terribly, but I guess better than expected it to do even worse. But he's a good economist, and he was trying to create a cascade. So clearly, social media creates opportunities for cascade effects. And Duncan Watts has done work on the circumstance, and many others, the circumstances in which they work out. But you raise a great question, which is whether for today's Beatles, it could be a great boon because you can get access to a lot of people in an instant, or a great challenge because the number of people who are doing that is so high. And I think basically there are empirical and also very technical economic work that could be done that could illuminate the circumstances under which one effect would dominate.
And if it's okay, I have a follow-up question, a little bit related to cancel culture and the idea of like how things can snowball in that sense. What about like a negative information cascade? Has that kind of been thought about in the sense of like one thing goes wrong and then that perpetuates to the point where this whole band is canceled or an entire person is canceled? How does that fit in with this model?
That's great. So on group polarization, there's work on outrage, which shows that a group of people tends to be more outraged after talking to each other than the median member. And so that would fit with the aggravation of rage. So that is undoubtedly true. And so I want to go separately with informational cascades, cancel culture, reputational cascades, cancel culture, network effects and cancel culture, and reputation and group polarization and cancel culture. I don't know of any work that's explicitly on that, but there is work that's really close. Completely. And people who get caught up in seeking to cancel often are subject to the same forces as Beatlemania, with a heightened emotional something that they may actually enjoy feeling or kind of need to feel so as not to get. Yeah. Okay, this is great.
You.
It's great. Does cascade effects affect election process? Completely. Candidate A can be a beneficiary of an early victory, and that will promote informational pressure. It's all the little thing I talked about with books and John and Paul and George choosing. That's happening with individuals and groups with respect to whom to vote for all the time. So I worked on the Obama campaign and I saw the cascade effect where there was, a candidate who was young and unknown and had a name that was not the likeliest name for the president of the United States. And it snowballed in exactly that way, where the word snowball is an informational cascade, and you could model it. There's something very cool. Matthew Rabin has done work on naive herding, where you could have a fully rational informational cascade, where people are rationally attending to the signal given by others. So it's just Bayesian. And you don't eat dark chocolate that tastes terrible a second time, but maybe you try it the first time, and that's all Bayesian. But what Rabin says is that people are naive herders. That is, they neglect the extent to which participants in the cascade aren't making independent judgments, but are themselves moved by the signals given by others. So you can have a very large cascade where the number of people who made independent judgments is tiny, and hardly anyone knows that. And I think that happens in politics, where people join a cascade in favor of X or Y or Z, thinking all those people can't be wrong, but there weren't that many people who thought it through. Now, with consumer products, it might be different because you have experience of the thing. So you could have multiple equilibria in popularity of a good product. It could have been another good product, but if the product was terrible, the cascade would have proved fragile. Okay, do humans naturally evolve to polarize? I think we need to think about the dynamics of group polarization. So I saw in real time some of the tapes of some group polarization experiments, and this is very reckless, but in the tapes, what seemed like the dominant reason was information exchange. So if you've got a group of people that tends to think climate change isn't a problem, that's what the median member thinks, then most people in the group will be saying why climate change isn't a problem. Just that's statistical because that's the dominant opinion of the group. And so people are hearing that. And then they're not hearing that climate change is a problem much. They're hearing it a little bit. But if they're listening to one another, once all the information is out, they'll think, oh, climate change is even less of a problem than I thought. And that doesn't depend on anything about natural or evolution. It's just updating depending on what you're hearing.
Excellent. So I believe we still have time. There is a question from Gianluca. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for the highly entertaining presentation. Yeah, I mean, there are many examples in the history of music of people who initially seem to fail badly and then perhaps by a miracle, yeah, they really made big success. So I'm thinking of Giuseppe Verdi, probably the person who is considered the greatest Italian opera composer. I think well, I'm sure he was never admitted to school academy, so he was basically a self-taught musician. His first operas were fiascos, but then he managed to really make a living. I think, yeah, also, if you look at the reputation of Johann Sebastian Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach was basically forgotten until Mendelssohn kind of revived his luck. So I think that there are a lot of examples of this type, but I'm not sure that everything can be brought down to network effects of this type. And I think what is missing maybe in your analysis is that the same product, in this case, a song, can have a completely different appeal to people, whether it is consumed privately or publicly. So there are many characteristics of a song that can really determine the public success, because when people show that they like a song, they also want to show that they support the social image that comes with that song. And so they could publicly express endorsement for a song that they would never maybe listen to if they did that privately. Yeah, I think, this aspect cannot be fully, I think, incorporated into, an experimental design in which we compare tastes when the fruition of the song is entirely private, in analogy to a context in which instead the song has a strongly public component.
That's great. And it bears on culture and politics generally, where if you signal you like Kanye West, you might want to be signaling what kind of person you are, or if you like Bach, that you might not particularly, but you're signaling membership or something. That you're right. I don't talk about that. That's important. I'm wondering, like, a lot about the success. The Beatles, it all happened in a very compressed period, but for Bach and Verdi and Keats, it happened, in some cases long after their life. Well, why did that happen? Now, one view would be that there's some cultural connection that they had with someone who lived long after they did, with the culture. That's hindsight, that's pleasing in hindsight. I'm sure, of course, you're right. That's correct. That to say that the Beatles are the best ever, if I said that to, I have a 13-year-old son, if I said that to a group consisting of him and his friends, they would think Dad's old. So it would be signaling, like liking something that's done. But you could see exactly the opposite.
Excellent. So maybe you are not aware that Professor Grimalda is not only a great behavioral scientist, but also a fantastic musician. So he is very much interested in the music angle. So we have time for one last short question, if there is any.
I do know that everyone's going to ask a question, so if you don't, you'll really be left out. There's a good question about the network structures that might facilitate cascades. That's very good. I defer to Watts's papers on this, which suggests some surprises. One of which is that the idea that there are important influencers who dominate everything is apparently not true. So it's online, at least it's much more decentralized. But that's a placeholder for his papers.
That was a very interesting point. So, Paulius, unless you have any last-minute announcement, I believe it is time to thank Professor Sunstein for this great and really intriguing talk. And maybe, Paulius, could you please remind the audience of the next speaker and date?
Yes, of course. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Sunstein, for joining us, and thank you so much, everyone in the audience. So you will get reminders on your email, as always, and the information is on our website. But in 2 weeks, we will have Peter Hall from Brown University with us. Same link, same time. Yeah, and you will get the reminder. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Professor Sunstein, for being here with us today.
Thank you all. Thanks, everyone.